Welcome everybody to this very exciting occasion. This is the first installment in what we plan will be an ongoing new series here at the Faculty of ABP called Research Conversations. Like everywhere else at this university, amazing research is taking place at the Faculty of ABP, and we look forward to sharing it with our alumni and wider community through these online conversations. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this meeting is taking place. And that might be multiple lands, of course, given the location of all of you today. And I pay my respects to these owners, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present today. Today, we will be hearing from Associate Professor Janet Stanley on her research into the link between urban planning outcomes and bushfires. Janet is a Principal Research Fellow of Urban Social Resilience at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. She originally specialized in child protection and family violence, and now focuses on the interface between social, environmental, and economic issues in climate change and sustainability across policy, system design, and at community levels. This work particularly focuses on sustainability issues for those people experiencing social exclusion and disadvantage. Janet will be in conversation with Professor Brenton Gleason, Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. Brenton was previously the Deputy Director of the National University of Ireland's National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis. Brenton has made significant scholarly contributions in urban and social policy, environmental theory and policy, and is a regular commentator in newspapers, television, and radio. His research interests include urban planning and governance, social policy, disability studies, and environmental theory and policy. His recent work has focused on socio-spatial analysis of suburbs, their vulnerability to oil shocks, and the need for better public transport options. Before I hand over to Brendan and Janet, a quick reminder to our audience to submit any questions you might have for our speakers through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. After the conversation between Brendan and Janet has concluded at probably around 12:30 or so, we will endeavor to answer as many of your questions as time allows before we wrap up at around 1 p.m. And with that, I would like to hand over now to Janet and Brendan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for that introduction and including the acknowledgement of country or countries. Welcome to everyone who's joined us at the webinar. I can't say it's great to see you because I can't see you, but it's really nice to have everyone. Simon was able to share a list of people who signed up, so we've got a bit of an idea that quite a lot of people are joining us from off campus today, which is terrific. We really like that aspect of things, and we've got people from different sectors, students and whatnot. So that's fantastic. Janet, fantastic to see you, and good to be in conversation. We're often in conversation. We work together in the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, which is based in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and it's a great place to be, and really like working with you. But I haven't had an opportunity to talk with you in this kind of way and in public, so it's long overdue, and I'm looking forward to it. Just going into this, I have to say I hope you and everyone's doing all right under lockdown. Numbers are good here in Melbourne today. Well, no numbers are good, but they're better than they have been, and we're all hoping with some expectancy that there'll be a relaxation of the lockdown coming up. And I guess I'm raising that issue just to acknowledge that's the context we're in, but also I don't think it's irrelevant to today's discussion. I won't delay us on this now, Janet. We'll go to the discussion today, which is about bushfires and planning and peri-urban and out-of-urban regions and social infrastructure and the like, and climate change. But I'm just picking up that earlier in the week there was a report, which I haven't read, but was covered in The Age by one of the authors is our good friend Mike Buxton at RMIT, and it points yet again to the problem. They looked at some case study out of suburban localities in Melbourne of the impoverishment of employment and social infrastructure in these places. And the reason I'm raising this now and linking to COVID is it's really brought to the fore. We're learning a lot through COVID about how cities function and don't function, particularly under stress. We're learning about risks but also resilience. But the 5 kilometre radius, which we're locked down under here in Melbourne, has proved really, the point these authors are making, Mike Bucks and others, proved really problematical for people in these communities that are impoverished in terms of social infrastructure and employment. How do those things are not within 5 kilometres. We don't have a 5 kilometre city. You'll talk later, I think, about the 20-minute city. So anyway, just raising that as we start, because we'll go to the question of social infrastructure and thinking about it in these COVID times. So I just want to go straight to you now, and let's swing it back around to bushfires. It's really great we're having this conversation because they've been a big event, haven't they, in Australia in the last, apart from the pandemic, in the last year and more. The situation has been worsening over time. So it's really important that we don't forget to bring it back into conversation with summer coming at us and bushfire season again. So can I just open by asking you to just give us some general commentary on what's the situation we're facing here with bushfires in Australia?
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you for those introductory remarks. Yes, I agree with you that COVID is actually really part of our conversation too, and we'll talk about it perhaps a little bit later, but it's brought to stark reality the growing inequality in Australia at the moment and the levels of disadvantage, and the fact that when we have these disaster events, that these are the people who actually experience negative impacts the most. And also, as we'll talk about shortly, I think it's actually not unlinked to bushfires, the extent of disadvantage that Australia has at the moment. But just to get back to the problem we're facing with bushfires at the moment, and it's very much linked with the fact that, in my view, that and many other scientists, that we are actually in climate change now, and we can't deny this fact, and it's facing us very starkly, as it did in Australia recently, and is currently in California, where we hear a lot about the shocking fires there. And the impact of climate change seems to be mostly impacting people around these extreme events, drought, sea level rise, and the fact that we don't just get one, we get building, they piggyback on top of each other. So we've had the drought in Australia, we've had the bushfires, and now we've got COVID. So all these things build into a much bigger problem. And of course, this is in the context of population rising, loss of biodiversity, and other compounding sort of factors that we have to bring in around all this. And I'm of the view that we actually might well be at a threshold point with bushfires. I think the bushfires we're experiencing currently are perhaps a marked change to historical patterns. And we can see this in the increase in number of fires that we're having. It's extraordinary, the number of fires, and in Australia they're increasing every year, but they're not only increasing in numbers, they're increasing in severity, such that we've now had to have a category of catastrophic fires to actually explain what's happening. And these are fires that are erratic, unpredictable, create their own weather, and it's not clear where they're going to move at any one point of time, and they create other fires too. And they're also in areas where we've never had fires before. It's unbelievable. We've got fires in Alaska, we've had them in the Arctic Circle, we've got them in Siberia at the moment, we've got them in the Australian rainforests up in the north of Queensland and down in Tasmania. Wet forests, rainforests that have never had fires before in history. So these things sort of show that we're actually in a climate emergency. And if we look at the average temperature rise around the world, it's about 1 degree, I think, Brendan, is that right? And look at the fires we're getting with a 1 degree. Now we're aiming in the current climate and the policy setting for up to 3 to 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Imagine the fires that will occur unless we do something to address all these problems.
Yeah, they're great. It's somewhat chilling. Well, we can talk about chilling with bushfires. I do that next, but they're quite focusing those considerations. And you're pointing also to the intersection of this, you know, the rapid and large-scale population growth that we've had in, particularly in the last decade or more, or longer, in Australia. Some of the highest rates we've experienced, almost all of which is typical of our migration stream going into a couple of the major metropolitan regions, which are growing and growing and growing. And can you comment, is there a problem there? That outward growth, despite the commitment supposedly in policy to the compact city policy for the last decades, it's been more honoured in the breach, and our cities have continued to grow ever outwards, and we'll come back to that. But can you tell us things, that outward growth, is it pushing into more riskier areas with bushfire? Is there a sort of bad intersection happening there?
Yes, and this is a world-wide trend, unfortunately, that we're actually growing cities in a sprawling way, mainly in car-dependent cities like US and New Zealand, Australia. Europe doesn't have this problem quite as much, but it's brought about by a number of factors, and it's housing affordability, big population rise, and lack of services and transport and things in the edges of these towns, which actually lead people to the people deliberately light fires, particularly youth. But we can talk about that a little bit further. But most fires occur on the urban interface around the world, and this is where, around the world, houses are being built very rapidly at the moment. But also in Australia, we like the lifestyle of living in a natural area and into bush areas, and this makes us also very vulnerable to fire too. Melbourne has spread, and the population spread all around the edges of Melbourne, and is increasingly doing so, which poses problems too, and poses issues like personal rights, common rights. What's the situation? Should we allow people to live where they just want to, or should we have some sort of approach to who's going to be responsible when the fire occurs with people who spread out like this? All these questions need to be discussed and resolved, and I don't think this is happening at the moment.
I've related this to you, had the experience of in Canberra and the fires that happened in the early 2000s there. I was on Planning and Land Council and witnessed the debate there between the planners and political leaders and community leaders that got really emotional. And people would, some people really wanted to go back into those areas that were devastated by the fires and which were deemed to be very hazardous, but planners and emergency management people didn't want that to happen. But in many cases lost the argument. So it points to a really difficult and emotive issue, isn't it? It's not just a technical issue around...
No, that's right. That's right. And it's an issue that's not really being discussed. I think planning's doing a lot better around the actual structural integrity to resist bushfires in new housing. But of course, we've been left with this huge amount of legacy housing where it's extremely expensive to retrofit to make them more fire sustainable. So that problem hasn't actually been addressed greatly, although it may be well addressed when the insurance companies refuse to insure some houses that are actually particularly vulnerable. But it's better if we're on the front foot and discuss that as a community and with planners about the sort of approach and the sort of resources that will be needed, and who should pay for those resources if someone chooses to live in a fire-prone area. So it is a big area that needs a lot of consideration.
Yeah, really up against the issue of private property rights and
Yeah.
people's historical expectations. I mean, we hear now that under COVID, lots of people are attempting to relocate out of Melbourne into
Yes.
peri-urban areas, which is
Yes.
another flow or stream into there, which have been
Yes.
growing
Yes.
around Melbourne for a while.
Yes. Peri-urban areas are a problem too, but if they actually move to regional areas, it's possibly a good thing, because the regional areas they've been, their productivity, economic productivity has been low, reducing. So getting a few more people in planned and well-planned areas in regions would probably be a good idea.
So what are we doing about bushfires in Australia? Many of us don't really have a background or the language or understanding of what our institutional arrangements are and what are the various things that are done and not done. Can you take us through some of that?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, the whole world's been pretty well caught unprepared with bushfires, if you want to sum it up in a swift statement. And the rise in bushfires to this catastrophic levels is really only fairly recent, and probably reflects partly the fact that the temperature has particularly been rising and the climate change problems since the 1970s. So it's sort of in recent decade or two that we've been having these increasingly problematical fires. So we're not actually very well prepared. There has been many inquiries into bushfires in Australia and also overseas, but the recommendations aren't really taken a lot of notice of, and also they're very narrow inquiries, and that's partly the issue that appears. There's indications might be coming out of our current Royal Commission into bushfires that they're actually not looking at the whole gamut of issues around bushfires. What happens, just to be a bit more specific, when we look at bushfires, we look mainly at preparation, planning, suppression and rehabilitation. They're the sort of key areas we look at. But my argument is we need to move back further and look at prevention, because there seems to be a belief that we can't do anything to stop these fires. And I think we can actually reduce the number of fires by taking some preventative action. And a lot of this sits around urban planning, a lot of the things we can do. And so we need to actually look at the whole picture, and it doesn't seem as if the Royal Commission is going to come out with this again at the moment, along with something like the 34 major fire inquiries we've had in the last few years. It's going to talk about New South Wales inquiry, also talked about suppression, which is really important. All these things are very important, but I don't think they're the whole picture that's coming out. And the current Royal Commission really doesn't mention climate change, unfortunately, and I think this is a big oversight. It might in its final report. It's only putting out sort of feeders of information at the moment.
I'm aware of the I guess, response or planning response category, suppression. I learned through these conversations with you that makes sense. We want to suppress the fires, but yeah, understandably, in the context of emergencies, the focus is on just getting them out. I think you've made the point; they're getting harder to get out.
Yep.
Now we've got to because of their intensity and the other factors that are linked to climate change. But you're developing for us some thinking around planning. We can come to that and sort of what that really looks like on the ground. Say at the state level, new planned communities. Also planning overlays and those kind of provisions. We've had, as you said, any number of inquiries in Victoria and interstate that have made recommendations to improve planning, but we've had a very faltering record, haven't we, in implementing those? So that's one of the first issues.
Yes,
surely.
That's right. And integration between all the sectors, as I said, between prevention, planning, suppression and rehabilitation is really important. but it's also widening out the conversation to other people, and including centrally planning in the conversation. Alan Marsh and other colleagues in the faculty are doing some really excellent work on how we can do this integration, funded by the Bushfires CRC. And really, planning has got a very important role, because it actually decides how the shape of the city, the structure, what should be where, and the type of measures that should be put in houses to protect them. So we need to use this valuable information and discipline to actually put people out of the vulnerable areas, structure the urban landscape, so we reduce the effect of fire. And the sort of things that on the ground, a lot of fires are caused by accidental activities of people. So getting people, as we talked earlier, out of the vulnerable areas on the edge of cities, stopping the cities spreading, densifying the cities, we've been quite successful in getting new dwellings, the structure. In fact, I think I would say we're pretty much a world leader around planning around actual structures. But as I mentioned before, there's the problem of legacy, and people are already out there. So what do? We've spread people, and now we've got this huge problem that's hit. So we've got to actually backpedal and do things about that, which we don't seem to be doing. And extends to things like where we site schools. Let's put them in vulnerable areas, nursing homes. Make sure that we've got water storage right near where the vulnerable areas are. Access to roads, so the fire brigade can get around and actually locate fire brigades in areas which are vulnerable, give them the resources and the ability to base somewhere in these areas. Brendan, have you got some thoughts around this that you can contribute around planning, being far more an expert than I am?
I don't know about that, but you and I cheated earlier, had a little chat before this, and I was saying, for our planners, I would say in many contexts at local level, who will, advise good planning principles, but, the leadership is lost, or councillors will take decisions in a different direction against planning advice. The development community puts a lot of pressure on. Cities, urbanisation is driven as much by the play of social and political power as anything. And we often think in the abstract, and we should, and in technical ways, about the best ways of undertaking planning. We know a lot about it in terms of these issues, but it's on the ground what happens, how planning actually happens as a political process where a lot of things go astray. And I don't have great or special insight to offer, other than I think the state government should be more decisively involved in matters of planning like this that are of such significance at the local level. We've certainly seen a lot of shenanigans going on in local governments, reminding us, how the leadership is often not there, or it's in cahoots with developers, and bad planning outcomes happen. So, that would be one comment from me about state leadership and direction.
Yes. And perhaps it's important to say, which I haven't said yet, is that when you look at prevention, we need to understand more about how fires start, prevention of lighting the fires in the first place. And historically, we think up to half and even over half of fires are purposefully lit. And this is why the urban fringe becomes such a problem. But also there's a high proportion of accidents that happen. So on the edge, your people, machinery, farms on the edge of Melbourne and in the farming areas, and burning off, clearing land, all become significant problems, and with the actual lighting of fires. So I think that's a very important part of planning too, which also goes to the idea of back to Jane Jacobs with eyes on the street. So we can do a lot of situational planning too, and structure of the actual urban landscape, making areas populated, opening up areas where hotspots of fires occur. Youth who light fires like to light some rubbish that's dumped nearby, near an urban area, a car that's dumped, removing them very quickly. So there's a lot of things like that can be done to actually minimise the chance of a fire actually being accidentally or purposely lit.
Yeah, you know, urbanisation, particularly when it's not well managed, produces a lot of combustible waste and material. And again, here we go in the age yesterday talking about the bullet tip catching fire.
Yes, yes.
And the age clearly saying that was a legacy of, or at least implying legacy of mismanagement. And you know, we've known there's been a crisis in the waste area, a very laissez-faire approach, which is now catching up with us. Thankfully, state government acting, as I've said in that other way, quite decisively about that now, and the EPA getting stronger powers to deal with this. But you know, urbanisation is messy and complex and raises lots of risks, and fires, I think what's coming out of this conversation, are going to be much more to the fore in those sort of risks. We haven't tended to think about them in metropolitan terms, but think back to the last summer, where here in the terrible fires, and everyone across Melbourne was touched. Most people were smothered, as I was in North Melbourne here, by the red dust.
Yes.
In fact, you know, one of my pot plants has finally turned up its toes. Plants didn't like the red dust. But, you know, you couldn't escape it in the inner city. You know, the testimony of the fires was with us.
Very dangerous dust too. I mean, there was something like 500 extra deaths in Australia as a result of the air pollution from the fires. So it's not a small problem, and it's not a small problem that the Western California in the USA is having at the moment with this smoke and particulates that are coming from the fire.
Yes, well, people have raised the issue, you know, from the health sector about, well, pandemic COVID, you know, being a respiratory illness, amongst other things. The intersection of that and poor air quality, we've got another summer coming at us. It's all very concerning when you think about it. We're just getting this larger picture of risk in our cities now, aren't we? The intersection of these different things, climate change, bushfire hazard, management, waste, waste and the like. I can see we're getting through the time, and we're going to have to, as Simon indicated, we'll want to hear from people who are here with their questions. But can we just take another minute or two? We haven't got onto that issue of the intersection of disadvantage and the lighting of fires and urban planning. Can you just give us a few thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting intersection that we've done a little bit of work on, but I'm really keen to do a lot more if possible. We did a project a year or so ago which looked at the growth of Melbourne and the under provision of infrastructure and services on the edge where people are going to get the affordable houses. And there was something like 9 billion underspend annually on the edges of Melbourne, which is a lot of money. And it comes with roads, with schools, with capital input, with jobs. One of the links that I'm making is that, unfortunately, on the edge of some of the cities on the edge of Melbourne, in some of the suburbs pre-COVID, we had something like 30% in some of the suburbs of young people underemployed or unemployed. Now that's totally unacceptable, and most people, the biggest cohort of people who light fires, malicious fires, are youth. About 40% of malicious fires, I think, are lit by young people. It's sort of a disaster waiting to happen when we've got disadvantaged, kids who are unemployed, probably very angry, unoccupied, let's go and have some fun, let's light some fireworks in the bush, not so much maliciously, but accidents happen, running around with cars through the bush, lighting fires accidentally in climate change conditions with sparks coming from the fire or some sort of equipment they're using. So it is a real problem, and it's, as we started this conversation with COVID and disadvantage, I'm linking a lot of this disadvantage along the edge, in the edges of regional towns too. It's not only on the edge of Melbourne. It's a lack of services for youth and jobs in a lot of regional areas, with lighting fires, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that points to, I think, I've heard you make these points about, and people like Alan March and other good colleagues who are working in these areas, and I'm sure some of our colleagues at RMIT have been making these points too, about improved planning around hazard and risk management, the need to better integrate urban planning and emergency services generally. And I think that actually brings in, as you're saying, even the police, doesn't it? I think you've worked with Victoria Police.
Yeah.
To think about ways, sort of social ways of thinking, rather than simply, locking people up. But what are the ways that planners and, emergency field can work with the police to prevent these things happening and to prevent youth from getting into this kind of trouble? It goes back, as you say, to issues around employment and social inclusion. But there's that integration question, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a very good group that I'm a member of the committee in, called the Gippsland Arson Prevention Program, and that's where we, on a local base, we get together with the emergency services, the police, the council, the business community, and a whole lot of representatives with an interest in this, where we talk about how to prevent bushfires in Gippsland. And a lot of good work's been done over many years, and it's a great model which could be rolled out much more widely across Victoria, because often local people know a lot more. They know who's likely to light a fire where the problem kids are, where are the vulnerable areas, who's living by themselves that mightn't be able to get away from the fire in awkward situations. And what are the factors that are actually leading to fires being lit in the local area at the moment. So it's a very powerful tool that could be modelled elsewhere.
It's great to hear a real example of something on the ground of what we were just talking about, and people might want to follow that up. Perhaps just last thought, and then we better transition out to questions and get some really good input from people who are with us here. Arson's important, and in the ways you explain, and the stats are quite compelling. But we've got a little bit of a difficult narrative, don't we, to manage from, as we saw over the summer, from those that say that arson's really the only problem. There's no climate change. There's some people trying to twist that narrative.
Yeah.
We've got to keep coming back to the fact that it's the intersection of the two, climate change and social exclusion, that we've really got to point to without downplaying climate change as a...
Yes, and accidents. In the past, fires could be... It didn't matter so much that people lit fires because they could be put out. There wasn't the climate change element that's entered into it. Now it's not. It doesn't appear possible to do this with some fires. They get so big that they create their own fires.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that. So with that, if Simon's there and can help us with the questions, I think we're good to go.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks so much, Janet and Brendan, for this really insightful conversation. As we have received quite a number of questions already, so I think we can start right away with the audience Q&A. And I might combine a few questions on similar topics. One is around the question of, what kind of main mechanism would we change or add into our planning system to reduce fire ignition and impacts? Or I guess in other words, what kind of practical tips would you have for planners for better planning for bushfires? Is there a structural change that we would have to implement?
Do you want to answer that, Brendan, or will I have a go?
I think you have a go at that, and then I'll
All right.
see if there's
Okay.
anything I can add afterwards.
Look, I think the most important thing, and it's the work that's been done over the last few years, led by Alan Marsh, which is integrating the legislation around planning and emergency services, understanding how the two read together. So putting it such that we all move in the one direction. We know the emergency services knows a lot about where it's vulnerable to bushfires, and actually having that conversation with the planners before a new area is opened up, for instance, or additional buildings are put in, like a lot of tourist developments are put in highly vulnerable areas. So just getting this conversation and a means of adjusting the legislation so that they read well together, and actually have opportunities for talking to the two areas of disciplines, so we actually can work together. But it actually does move beyond planning and emergency services. We need environmentalists, we need people who work with troubled children, we need policymakers. So it's a very wide conversation that's not being had. We're leaving much of this issue to the fire services, who've traditionally done it, and they do it very well. But it's a much wider problem now that we're facing than ever before.
Right. I would add that we're not going to get to a safer place without planning. It's not simply, emergency services, and they know that, or fire response, because it's a problem that's fundamentally related to spatial arrangements and how we allow cities to grow, where people live and interact and act. So I would just underline what Janet's saying, but also I think planners need to act tactically. Planning's a political process, and mobilise and enlist for support from the earliest stages of the planning process on the ground and locally, the emergency services people and even the police, to put some backbone into planning on the ground. Because whenever we have one of these terrible things that happens, like Black Saturday, the Canberra fires, there's a sort of a moment, an historical moment of action, a commission of inquiry, and then the forces of inertia and even reaction come into play and start pushing it backwards again. So it's really important that planners act practically and tactically on the ground, and forming alliances, really, policy alliances with emergency services and even, where it's necessary, the police, but also, as Janet says, social workers and the like are going to be important.
And environmentalists too, Brendan. I left them out because at the moment there's little consideration of a lot of the planning work by emergency services and local government is to do environmental modification, and there's not nearly enough consideration of the impact of what they're doing. There needs to be a huge amount of research around that, because we're just not up to scratch with that, nor are all the judgments and values considered before all this is done.
Thanks so much for that. We've had a couple of questions here in regard that I think speak to, I guess, the role of these communities living in the outer suburbs, and maybe their knowledge or maybe lack of knowledge, and maybe that leads to what support we need to lend them. One of our audience members pointing out people moving to the fringe areas with bush often won't have the same understanding of how to manage that land as, let's say, farmers who would have been in that land previously would have. Another audience member asking, is there any research that looks specifically at the possible causal effect between people being progressively separated from the land and the natural systems, or knowledge of those natural systems, and then engaging in behaviors that are destructive? Do we have to educate communities differently that live in these outer areas, maybe?
That's a difficult question, because I think the circumstances have so changed that none of us know, and there's so little research done on this. I would say that because I'm a researcher, but we just haven't been prepared to address so many of these issues and try and understand exactly what's happening. When you put houses together, it's often the fact that the fire jumps from one house to the other as a source of fuel. So it is highly complex, and I don't think you can particularly say that some groups are less knowledgeable than others. I think we all are not very knowledgeable about this at the moment.
I think I'd add, particularly the peri-urban areas, that it's a tricky problem. I see where those questions are coming from, and there's analogies in other areas like managing biodiversity, because it's largely a problem of managing private land, which from a public policy perspective is a real challenge, you know, given people's attachment to property rights and the thing. So you know, there's some thinking, some research and learning that's been done in, say, overlays and managing for biodiversity and other environmental values and attributes on private land. But it's fair to say that I think that this is just such a compelling and difficult issue that it actually needs quite a decisive response from the state, because it is just so risky for the entire community. And you know, the history has been looking for voluntary overlays and voluntary compliance, and I think the testimony of risk is that we need to move beyond that now. We need to have more decisive overlays, and as Janet says, we need to catch up with the present, because the conditions and the risk conditions have changed in those areas, and I don't think our science and research has kept up with that yet enough.
There's a lot of interest in cultural burning, Indigenous burning, and I think we can learn a lot about that, especially around how that's managed with the terrible environmental destruction that's going on at the moment, because it is very much a balance of all sorts of things, but at the moment economics seems to, and personal rights seems to be dominant, but we gave up a lot of personal rights with COVID. What other circumstances perhaps should we be doing this? So these are all really important discussions that the whole of communities, the whole of Australian society needs to have. We just need to open all these up, I think, and try and thrash some of these issues out.
There's another question that has come in here on that topic. One of our audience members is asking, what impact do you think do programs such as JFAIP, which is the Juvenile Fire Awareness and Intervention Program, have? And I guess there might well be other initiatives that various levels of governments have implemented. Do you think those initiatives have an impact, or do you think, maybe firstly, is there a sufficient awareness within government of these specific problems? And do you think what has been put in place so far, has that had impact, or has it been efficient?
Certainly, it's a whole area which needs a huge amount of attention. The Juvenile Fire Awareness Programs is run by the fire services, and it assists children who are tendency to light fires and play with matches. I'm not aware that anywhere they've been completely evaluated as to their effectiveness. They're small scale. They're another job that the fire brigade's given, and it actually it involves about, it varies between sites, but about 6 or 7 visits. And if you've got a very disturbed child, I cannot see how that would make a major difference. But I think there's some signs that with some children it is helping. But I think this is where we need to expand and bring in a whole lot more people, a lot more knowledge. It's been put there, frankly, because there's no other treatment available for people who light fires. And also the police need a lot more resources to help them deal with this. Less than 1% of people who light fires are caught and convicted. So it's a behaviour that you don't make obvious to other people. And they need to be, the fire brigades need to be greatly supported in all these programs. We need to upscale dramatically what we do and don't do around to cover what we don't do in this area.
Yeah, I think so much of the narrative is around planning and prevention. And when you're saying, Janet, I didn't know that statistic, only 1% of fire people
Less
like
than
less arsonists are caught and convicted. And maybe hard to ever, improve on that. It just shows why prevention is so important and why we need contributions from people like social psychology, public health, social work, those fields, to help the emergency services and the police. So that, because when it comes, if it gets to the nth degree and it becomes a crime, it's bad for everyone, bad for the person, who's committing the crime, and then, what happens in terms of the whole community impact as well. So planning and prevention is underlined, isn't it, to these considerations?
One of the topics that have come up in the questions we have received focus on density, probably quite naturally. One of our audience members pointing out, we've just heard today from our treasurer that that our population is, or with COVID, with the impacts of COVID-19, our population is likely, at least for the time being, to shrink and age. Another audience member asking, would it then make sense from a density point of view? Does it make sense to, rather than keeping on spreading out, do we need to increase? Should we look at increasing density within the inner and middle ring suburbs rather than spreading out? Is that a way to address the problems we are debating today?
Yes, definitely. The planning's also got a role in addressing climate change and reduction of emissions too. And if you've got a more compact city, you've got less travel, less car travel, able to put in more renewable generation systems, shared systems around the community. And Brenton and I could talk forever on the 20-minute city and the building up of neighbourhoods for many reasons, for climate change reasons, for provision of services, for reducing inequality and disadvantage. Do you want to talk a bit more about the 20-minute city, Brenton?
Well, it's something we've been talking about for a long time, and it goes without really getting a long way towards its realisation in metropolitan Australia. It goes back to we tend to think, oh, this is a new idea that's come out of wherever, Portland, Oregon or something. It's not. It goes back to a century-old or more planning principle and tradition of containment, urban containment, and really what we would call now in the language of localisation, containment, having people live close to all the things they need, the activities they need to undertake, both from an efficiency but also an equity perspective. So they're very, very important things. So the latest in recent decades in planning, that's been understood through the compact city principle and policy setting, but there's really been what Clive Forster, the urbanist, called a couple of decades ago the parallel universe problem. We've got this compact city ideal that has been framing our metropolitan strategies for decades, but then we've got the reality of urbanisation, which is still fairly much unmanaged dispersion, with now actually coming from the sort of a market-driven version of compact city, this horrendous overdevelopment, particularly in city centres, with quite risky and poorly constructed high-rise development, and often justified in the name of compact city sustainability. It's anything but sustainable in my view. So I think what we need to get back to in terms of commitment and conversation is well planned, medium density, well located. The planning principles around that are clear. It's really just been the political purpose that has been lacking.
Mm. And it ticks so many boxes, doesn't it, Brendan? It ticks the climate change box, it clicks the equity box, it clicks the development of community to actually support and identify and help kids who are troubled, who might be dangerous on many levels. It's just a thing that, well, I believe we should be moving to, and it would just have so many benefits. But and in fact, a good bit of Melbourne, the inner middle ring of Melbourne, actually operates almost like that. But we've just deserted the outer suburbs and a lot of the urban regional centres, who have to travel long distances to get the services they need. And that's why kids are coming from the country into Melbourne to get education and jobs, because they're not provided out there.
Yes, no, thank you for raising that point, Janet. Actually, one of the questions that has come up does speak to that or ties in with that in that if we say there are obvious socio-demographic and economic challenges experienced by those living in the outer suburbs, what are the strategies that we could employ to enhance economic activities on those fringes, so we can reduce the developmental pressure in those areas?
Mm. Well, I think one of the things that's going to be happening as a result of COVID is we're going to have people move to regional areas quite a bit, and it's seeming a little bit already, which is, I think, taking the pressure off Melbourne, and the sprawl of Melbourne is a good thing. And it would also help the regions too, because the economic productivity in the regional areas is much lower now. It used not to be, but it's lower than the Melbourne productivity. So it'll help to get the resources and the services and the jobs and the industry more to regional areas. It's very hard to get jobs because it's a circular problem. In the edge of Melbourne, the disadvantage is such that people are leaving school earlier. They're not getting the qualifications, and a lot of the jobs now are in technical areas. Our manufacturing isn't that strong now at the moment, whereas you used to have the car industry and Dandenong and things, but that's not there now. And so the lower skills work just simply isn't there. So there's not the employment opportunities. And if you've got a kid that's left school early and there's no transport for him to get to a job sort of that's not out there but sort of more in the middle or the central of Melbourne, it's very hard to do that because the transport isn't there to get him there or to the educational opportunities.
Yeah,
do you have anything, Brendan? Yeah,
I sure do. This is where I would say take serious issue with analyses like the Grattan Institute and some other advocates of the view that, well, to focus on this idea that we've got the stable, rich or high quality employment is in the city centre in Australian cities now, in the CBD area around the knowledge economy, and we should be doing all we can to shift the population inwards, bulldozing the middle ring suburbs if we need. Sorry, I'm being a bit glib, but getting the population closer to those jobs. A large chunk of the population will never be matched to that economy or those jobs directly. We mustn't we must exercise commitment to social investment in other middle and outer ring communities in search of much better employment patterns. And health and educational services provide often high quality, in some instances low skills and quite accessible jobs. And we can square the circle if we're prepared to invest in social infrastructure in new communities and in those existing communities that lack it, because it provides jobs. It's often employment rich, health and education services, for example, TAFEs and the like. So I think we need a different kind of conversation around inward investment into new and existing urban communities and employment.
Thank you, Brenton. We're getting close to 1 p.m., but I think I might try to squeeze in a couple more questions before we wrap up. One topic that has come up is one of affordability, which I guess is not surprising given that we are talking about areas of sometimes socioeconomic disadvantage. One comment pointing out that until young families have a cost-neutral choice as to where they live, they will continue to make the cheaper choice of living on the fringe. Another audience member pointing out that if they recall correctly, people in the Dandenong Ranges were not required to rebuild their burned-out homes to the latest bushfire-proof standards because it was seen that the length of time to rebuild to those standards and the higher costs would cause distress to those that had lost their homes. So in a way, you have a potentially disadvantaged community living in those places, and then when disaster strikes, we ask them to, or do we ask them to spend the money on something that is quite expensive to rebuild? Do we need to have different kinds of support for people so they don't have to make those cheap, if you want, choices that land them potentially in difficult situations? Is there some kind of support that government needs to lend?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a societal problem in Australia at the moment, and in coming back to Victoria, where the housing policy is the rental. We're just not building the rental places, and the rents are too high, and we're actually putting people on New Start and unemployment benefits, where almost any rental property is unaffordable. So we're sort of, hence the increase of homelessness. So yes, the price of housing is a real problem, but we might get a dip in this with the lack of with the diminishing population growth as a result of COVID, but it might only be a short term for a year or two, which will make some houses more affordable for people. But yes, housing is a very big problem, and in my humble view, the federal government should be putting post-COVID reconstruction into social housing and assisting people to have affordable housing. The other point about rebuilding is it's a very tricky question, because most people want to go back to where they were because they've lost everything, and it's a sense of belonging, sense of place. That's where the community is, and we've already let them build there, and that's where they've got the right price and affordable housing in a place where they want to be. Again, it's coming back to this conversation: should we allow them to rebuild, or should we help support them to rebuild? And just what as a society we do about these many problems that are arising with these repeat disasters that we're experiencing. Brendan, have you got some thoughts there?
Nothing to add to that wisdom. I agree with everything, and you should have the last word.
I think I might sneak in one very last question, one that is hopefully somewhat empowering as well, particularly to the planners in the audience. Today, there's been a few questions on essentially one is what data is available to inform planning decisions in light of the bushfire risk, and another similar question asks, where is the best information and advice on managing properties with trees or bush 30, 50 kilometers from the Melbourne centre, and who has responsibility for that advice? If we want to become more informed on this, what kind of action can we as the audience take? What repositories of knowledge are there?
Certainly, there's a big need to get information and data out to the public. At the moment, the source of ignition of fires even is not generally available by all people who collect fires. It is by some, the Victorian government, but other sources simply aren't available. So it just doesn't help anyone to know about the dangers. But there is a lot of work being done around mapping and vulnerability, and a lot of work that is being set up to actually do a lot of linking between planning and fire vulnerability. But there's been very little resources put into this, and there needs to be a lot more information about many things, both to people, both the planners and the fire services and the local population. It's an area of great need.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much. It's now just after 1 p.m, so I think we might start to wrap things up. Thank you so much once more to Janet and Brenton for sharing your expertise and insights today. There was a really insightful conversation. Thank you also to all our audience members for joining us today and for submitting your questions. I'm very sorry there's something like 25 questions still remaining in the Q&A. Thank you for all your interest, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to answer all of your questions, but I hope that you gained some insight from what we did discuss today. The Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute does run a number of events and initiatives throughout the year, and we would love to welcome you to these. Of course, they will be, or they might be on similar topics as to what we discussed today. So I will provide a link to these sessions tomorrow in the follow-up email that will go out to everybody. And that email will also include a link to the video recording of this session. And please feel free to share that, of course, with friends and colleagues who might be interested. So thank you once more to everybody, and we look forward to having you with us next time.